The carriage stopped at the edge of a winter-gray gravel sweep, and Georgiana Hartwell sat very still for a long moment, looking up at the pale stone face of Ashcroft Hall. It was vast. It was cold. The windows caught the January light and gave nothing back. She had known, in the abstract, that the Duke of Ashcroft was a wealthy man. She had known this the way one knows a fact read from a solicitor's letter, held at arm's length as numbers and proper nouns, £4,000 of her father's debt, written against the name Ashcroft and the name Hartwell in a hand that was not hers. She had known it without feeling it, the way one knows a distant country without knowing its particular cold. Now she felt it. The footman who handed her down from the carriage did not meet her eyes. The housekeeper who received her at the top of the stone steps introduced herself as Mrs. Penn and asked, with a precise and careful neutrality, whether Miss Hartwell had had a comfortable journey. Not Lady Hartwell, not even Mrs. Hartwell, which she had never been. Miss Hartwell, like a girl at her first introduction, like a parcel correctly labeled for delivery. She had been promised. That was the sum of it. Her father, Sir Reginald Hartwell, in his last and most reckless act of desperate administrative optimism, had written a betrothal promise to the Duke of Ashcroft as partial security against the £4,000 debt he had never managed to pay. He had died in November. The snow had come early that year, and the ground had been too hard for a churchyard, and the solicitor, Mr. Foss, had arrived 3 days after the burial with a sealed letter and a face that said the news was worse than she had prepared for. She had read the letter standing in the entrance hall of Hartwell Lodge, in a coat she had not yet taken off because the fire had not yet been lit, because the household had reduced to herself and one elderly cook by then. And she had read the words and felt the particular sensation of a door closing in a room she had believed was open. The Duke of Ashcroft had sent no letter. He had not written to her. He had sent only a carriage on the appointed day, as if she were luggage of sentimental value being retrieved from a railway office. She had climbed in. There had been very little else to do. The lodge was entailed to a cousin she had never met, and the £4,000 were real. And she had 23 years of life, and one good gray dress and the composure her mother had taught her, and none of those things was going to dissolve the debt. She followed Mrs. Penn through the hall's entrance, past marble columns and a staircase that rose in a pale curve toward upper floors she could not yet read, and into a long reception room where the fire had been lit against the cold, and where Edmund Ashcroft, 6th Duke of Ashcroft, was standing at the window with his hands clasped behind his back. He was perhaps 32. He was tall in the way that rooms organize themselves around a person when that person is the kind of authority the room has been built to contain. His hair was dark. His jaw was still. And when he turned from the window, his eyes were the color of deep water at the end of a gray day. Neither blue nor gray, but something in between that committed to nothing. He looked at her the way a man looks at a map. Not with contempt, with measurement. "Miss Hartwell," he said. His voice was level and unhurried. "You understand the terms." She did. The contract was explicit. She was to become his duchess, the debt was to be discharged against the marriage settlement, and the Hartwell name was to be preserved in whatever technical sense it could be preserved when the house behind it had already been given away. She understood the terms. She had read them 3 times on the carriage journey, in the gray winter light, until the words no longer looked like words. She said, "I am not a parcel." The room was very quiet. The fire shifted once in the grate. He looked at her with an expression that was not contempt and was not amusement, but was something her vocabulary did not immediately cover, a quality of attention that she could not read and therefore did not trust. His hands did not move. His jaw did not alter. "No," he said, "you are not." He turned back to the window. Mrs. Penn materialized at Georgiana's elbow and began the process of showing her to her rooms, and the audience with the Duke was apparently concluded. Georgiana followed the housekeeper up the curving stair, her back straight, her hands folded, her heartbeat doing something she chose not to name. She had been promised. She had arrived. She had spoken. What she could not yet see was that he had watched her go. The weeks between January and the first ball of the season were weeks in which Georgiana learned the geography of Ashcroft Hall, the way a prisoner learns a cell, through repetition rather than invitation. She was not unkindly treated. Mrs. Penn was correct and occasionally warm. The cook, a broad-armed Lincolnshire woman named Agnes, left a small plate of shortbread outside Georgiana's sitting-room door on the third morning, which Georgiana interpreted as institutional sympathy expressed in the only safe currency available. She was not introduced to the estate's tenants. She was not consulted on the household accounts. She was given a suite of rooms in the East Wing, a sitting room with a desk and a view of the kitchen garden, and a great deal of unasked-for time in which to consider her situation. She used the time, as she had used most of her adult years, on work. Her father's illness had been long, and the lodge's affairs had progressively consolidated themselves in her hands during its course. She knew the arithmetic of a household under strain. She knew how a debt of £4,000 accumulated across a decade of poor harvests, bad investments, and a landlord who could not bring himself to disappoint anyone who asked him for a favor. She had managed the lodge's accounts, corresponded with the creditors, dismissed staff she had known since childhood with letters she wrote carefully and with pain, and kept the books in the small, precise hand her mother had taught her before her mother died when Georgiana was 12. It was in reviewing Ashcroft Hall's tenant rolls, which she found by accident on the desk in the sitting room, and which had apparently been left there by oversight rather than intention, that she noticed the entry for the Mabry family of the Northfield cottage. £12 overdue in rent, accrued across 2 quarters, annotated in a hand that was not the estate agent's with a single word: pending. She would learn in the next 3 days exactly what was pending. The Mabry boy was 9 years old and named Thomas. He worked in the stable yard in the early mornings before school, which he attended on Tuesdays and Thursdays at the village, in an arrangement the estate agent had apparently organized and then apparently forgotten to continue funding. Thomas's mother, Ellen Mabry, was a widow of 2 years who washed the hall's table linens and grew carrots in the strip of kitchen garden beside the Northfield cottage, and who had, according to Agnes and to the particular quality of Agnes's voice when she mentioned it, been given notice by the estate agent, Mr. Price, at the end of November. Notice for £12. Georgiana found Thomas in the stable yard on a Thursday morning when she had gone out for air, and found instead a boy attempting to lift a hay bale half again his own weight, his face set in a straight-lipped expression of determined solitude that she recognized, with a physical sensation in the region of her sternum, as a younger version of her own. She helped him with the bale. He looked at her with the wariness children reserve for adults who have been kind to them, before suddenly, and without explanation, not being kind to them. "You are Thomas Mabry," she said. "Yes, miss." "Your mother is Ellen Mabry of the Northfield cottage." A pause. The wariness sharpened. "Yes, miss." "Tell your mother that the pending notation on your account is an error. Tell her the matter is being reviewed." She did not know, at that moment, whether the matter was being reviewed. She said it because the boy's face had the particular pinched quality of a person carrying weight they have been told is permanent. And she knew from experience that permanence is frequently administrative rather than actual. She was not aware, as she walked back across the stable yard toward the east wing, that the Duke was standing in the gallery window above, watching her through the glass. The season's first ball at Ashcroft Hall was held on the 17th of February, 1814, in the long gallery that ran the full width of the house's south front, lit by 4 rows of candles in crystal chandeliers and attended by the principal families of 3 counties, 46 guests in total, and Lady Dorothea Vane, the Duke's aunt, and the nearest thing Ashcroft Hall possessed to an autocratic local authority. Lady Vane was 61, sharp-faced, and wore jewelry of such density and confidence that it functioned less as adornment than as a declaration of territorial sovereignty. She had managed the Hall's social arrangements since the death of the previous Duchess, a period of 4 years, and she had managed them in a manner that made clear she intended to continue doing so regardless of any contractual complications that might have been introduced by a dead baronet's overreaching promise. She introduced Georgiana to the room that evening in a voice that carried to the fireplace and beyond. "Miss Hartwell," she said to Lord Dunning's wife, "who is with us by arrangement of a family matter, and who is quite new to company of this kind." Quite new to company of this kind. The words arrived in the room like a small, precise incision. Lord Dunning's wife, a large-hearted woman with unfortunate taste in feathers, looked briefly uncertain about the correct response and settled on a sympathetic smile. 3 other women within hearing distance exchanged a quality of glance that Georgiana had learned, over 23 years, to process quickly and file away. Georgiana said, "How kind," with perfect evenness, and moved on. Miss Cecily Drummond arrived at 9 o'clock in a gown of pale rose silk and a quantity of diamonds that established, without the use of words, the thesis that she was the correct choice. She was 20, fair-haired, and moved through a room as though rooms had been invented for the purpose of receiving her movement. She was everything the season approved of. She was everything Lady Vane had spent 4 years cultivating as an alternative to whatever administrative complication Sir Reginald Hartwell had created. She was placed at supper directly to the Duke's left. Georgiana was placed 12 seats distant, between a hard-of-hearing general and a very young man from Nottinghamshire, who was deeply absorbed in the question of whether this autumn might produce a better hunting season than the last. She answered the young man with the portion of her mind she did not require for other purposes, ate the soup she was brought, and kept her eyes on her own plate. The Duke spoke to Miss Drummond twice during supper. He spoke to Lady Vane once. He did not speak to Georgiana. He looked at her once, briefly and without expression, from 12 seats away. At the moment the soup was removed and the fish course arrived, and then he looked away again at something Mr. Price, the estate agent, was saying on his right. Georgiana was the one who saw Thomas Mabry in the corridor. She had excused herself between the fish course and the remove to retrieve a shawl she had left in the small anteroom off the entrance hall, and she was returning through the corridor when she saw him, the boy pressed against the wainscoting in his ordinary clothes, looking through the half-open door at the dining room with an expression of such focused longing that she stopped. "Thomas," she said quietly, "how did you get in?" He startled. "Through the kitchen passage, miss. Agnes lets me sometimes, to hear the music." The music from the long gallery above them was filtering down through the floorboards, something in 3/4 time that vibrated faintly in the plasterwork. She looked at him for a moment. This 9-year-old in his ordinary clothes, pressed against the wall of a house where he was shortly to have no connection at all unless the pending annotation was resolved. She said, "Come with me," and brought him into the anteroom and found the spare music sheets that were kept there for the family's informal evenings, and she sat him at the small pianoforte in the corner and showed him 3 notes of the melody coming down through the ceiling, and let him repeat them until his face had the absorbed quality of a person doing a necessary thing. She heard him play for 6 minutes, while the remove was served 12 feet away in the dining room, and then she told him he must go back through the kitchen passage and she straightened her shawl and returned to her seat at the table. She had not seen the door to the corridor open behind her while she sat beside Thomas at the piano. She had not seen the Duke standing in the doorframe for the full 6 minutes, his face arranged in an expression his aunt had never seen on him. She had not seen him watch her. That was the season's first ball. That was what she remembered of it. The weeks that followed were weeks of accumulated pressure. Lady Vane called on Georgiana in the East Wing sitting room on 3 separate occasions, each call more precise and more damaging than the last. The first concerned the proper management of a duke's household and was framed as instructional assistance, delivered in a tone that suggested Georgiana was a recent arrival from the provinces who had managed, through some combination of audacity and misdirected sympathy, to make herself more visible than was appropriate. The second call concerned Miss Drummond. Lady Vane described her, at length and with specific warmth, as a young woman of substantial connections, flawless education, and disposition ideally suited to the demands of a ducal household. The implicit construction was clear. The explicit statement was never made because Lady Vane was too skilled for explicit statements. Georgiana served tea and said nothing she could not afford to have repeated. The Duke, in this same stretch of weeks, did things she noticed and chose not to interpret. He altered the position of her place at the supper table 3 days after the ball, moving her from the far end to a seat 4 places from his own, citing, through Mrs. Penn, a need to reorganize the placement by county of residence. He sent, without comment, a library key to her sitting room, with a card on which he had written only, "The East Collection may interest you." He rode past the Northfield cottage on a Tuesday morning when Georgiana happened to be walking the path from the kitchen garden, and he slowed his horse, and he said, "The Mabry arrangement is being reviewed," and then rode on before she could determine whether she had imagined the entire exchange. She had not imagined it. She did not let herself consider what it meant. It was near the end of February, on a day when rain had closed the house in and made the East Wing's windows run with gray water, that she found the portrait. She had been looking for a 3rd volume of a natural history she had begun reading from the East Collection, and she had pushed a door open that she had believed led to a connecting passage and found instead a small sitting room clearly unused for some years, the furniture draped in Holland covers, the grate cold, and on the near wall a large portrait turned face inward, its back to the room. The frame was dusty. The room smelled of disuse and old grief and the particular absence of things that have been removed from regular life, not by loss, but by decision. She heard him behind her. She turned. He was standing in the doorway with the expression of a man who has found someone reading a letter not addressed to them. And then, fractionally, that expression dissolved into something else, something quieter and less controlled. A weather change in a face she had previously believed was made of the same material as the hall's exterior stone. "I apologize," she said. "I was looking for the passage to the north corridor." He did not move from the doorway for a moment. His gaze went to the portrait's back, to the gray dust on the frame's gilt corner, and he was briefly, privately somewhere she could not reach. "My wife," he said. "She died 4 years ago. Charlotte." He paused, and the pause had a specific weight, the weight of a name said aloud after a long absence. "She died in November, in the same month the portrait was turned. I have not been able to decide what to do with it since." She understood, with sudden clarity, why a man might take a betrothal promise from a dead baronet's estate and send a carriage on the appointed day without a letter, and why his voice was as level as a surveyor's instrument, and why he stood in rooms as though he were enduring them. She understood none of it with pity, which would have been wrong, but with a specific recognition. The recognition of a person who has also been carrying something heavy in a room that keeps expecting them to put it down. She said only, "I am sorry." She was fortunate in your remembrance of her. He looked at her then in a way that was different from all the other ways he had looked at her, and she did not know what to do with it. So she excused herself and found the correct passage to the north corridor and did not return to the east sitting room. If the listener knows what it is to want to be seen and to distrust the seeing when it comes, then Georgiana's situation at this point in the season may need no further explanation. Consider staying with her a little longer. The dinner for 30 was Lady Vane's event, organized under the pretext of introducing the neighboring families to the Duke's continued hospitality. It was, in the more precise sense, an arranged demonstration. Miss Drummond was seated to the Duke's right. Georgiana was seated, at Lady Vane's quiet instruction to the footman, at the table's far end, beside Mr. Price, who spent most of the meal explaining the difficulties of estate drainage, with the sincerity of a man who believes this is a topic of universal interest. Lady Vane waited until the dessert course, when conversation had reached the specific pitch of a large room full of wine and satisfied people, to say, loudly enough for the table's full extent, "We are all so grateful that Miss Hartwell has been accommodated so graciously at the Hall, given that her father's situation left her with so few alternatives. A woman of her narrow means must find the arrangement an immense relief." A woman of her narrow means. The table's nearer end registered it. The general near Georgiana's left elbow registered it. Mr. Price registered it in the particular way of a man who has delivered notice to a tenant on £12 and therefore has limited standing to feel moral discomfort. Georgiana set down her spoon. Her hands were quite steady. The candles on the table were 5 to a stand, placed at intervals of 3 feet, and she focused on the nearest one for long enough to give herself a frame. And then she looked down the table at Lady Vane with the expression of a woman who has been very cold for a very long time, and is accustomed to it. She said, "I am grateful for the Hall's hospitality, Lady Vane, as I hope the Hall is grateful for whatever I may contribute to it." The table recalibrated. There was no scene. Lady Vane smiled the smile of a woman who has won the point by forcing the response, and Georgiana looked once toward the head of the table, where the Duke sat with his jaw set like river ice, and his gaze on the middle distance, saying nothing. He said nothing all evening. She understood. Walking back through the corridor to the east wing after the dinner had concluded, and the guests had begun to scatter to their carriages, that she had misread the library key and the altered placement and the slow horse at the north field path. She had believed them to be one thing and they were something else, administration perhaps, or habit, or the behavior of a man going through the motions of courtesy toward a contracted obligation. He had not spoken for her. He had ratified Lady Vane's silence with his own. She would not stay to be managed. She sat at the desk in her East Wing sitting room, and she made a list. It was not a long list. It was the list of a person who has been practicing economy for long enough that the practice has become a form of self-knowledge. At the top of the list, she wrote £12. She had, in the event, £16 remaining from the household allowance she had brought from the lodge, the last savings of a year of careful management, carried in a flat leather purse her mother had given her before she died, a small plain thing with her mother's initials worn soft on the clasp. She had intended to use that money for the remaking of her second dress, which had begun to show its age at the elbows. She would not remake the dress. She wrote a note to Ellen Mabry on Hall Stationery, explaining that the outstanding £12 was discharged in full and that Mr. Price's notice was accordingly void. She included the £12 in folded notes. She wrote a second note to Mrs. Penn, informing her that she would be leaving Ashcroft Hall on the morning of the 24th and requesting that her trunk be brought down. She wrote a third note to Mr. Foss, the solicitor, advising him that she released her claim on any arrangement arising from her father's debt, on the grounds that she did not consider herself a contractual asset of the Hartwell estate, and that any gentleman who agreed was welcome to proceed accordingly. She sealed all 3 notes. She placed Ellen's note with the money on the kitchen table before Agnes was awake, at just past 5 in the morning, and she was walking back through the passage when she heard a footstep behind her and turned to find Thomas standing in his nightshirt, barefoot on the stone. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "are you going away?" The child's face was very still. She thought of what it must be to be 9 years old and to have a new person be briefly kind in a house that has mostly not been, and to see that person carrying the expression of someone who has concluded their business. "I am going away," she said, "but your family's arrangement with the hall is resolved. Your mother has the letter. The note by the kettle." He looked at her with the large, undefended eyes of a person who has not yet learned the various uses of pretending things are not what they are. "Will someone else come?" he asked. She did not answer that. She went back to the East Wing, sat at the desk, and waited for morning. The season's second ball was not Lady Vane's event. It was the Denborough Assembly, held 12 miles east at the home of Sir Charles Denborough, one of the county's senior peers, and attended by all of the same families who had attended the dinner for 30, plus several others who had heard, through the county's efficient informal communication system, that the situation at Ashcroft Hall had arrived at an interesting moment. Georgiana did not intend to be present. She arrived nonetheless, because Mrs. Penn had given her the note from the Duke at 7 that morning, and she had read it twice and could not determine, from its 4 precise sentences, whether she was being summoned or invited. She went because she was not willing to be managed, and leaving before she had been released was a form of management she was imposing on herself. She wore the gray dress. She carried no fan, because the fan she had brought from the lodge had a broken spoke she had not yet had mended. She arrived at the Denborough Assembly at 9, and the room's assessment of her arrival was visible in the way large rooms assess arrivals, a shift in the quality of attention, a ripple of redirected glance. Lady Vane was already there, settled in state near the fireplace with Miss Drummond, arranged at her hand like a thesis statement. Miss Drummond looked at Georgiana with the particular quality of a young woman whose certainty has been, in recent weeks, slightly less complete than it presented. Georgiana found a chair near the windows and sat in it. She sat there for 40 minutes. Conversations moved around her. Lord Dunning's wife stopped to speak to her about a music teacher she had recommended in the village, and Georgiana was grateful for the specificity of the topic. The general who had sat beside her at the dinner found her and apologized, obliquely and in his military way, for not having said something at the time. She thanked him without saying what she was thanking him for. At 50 minutes, Mr. Foss arrived. She had not expected Mr. Foss. He was a small, tidy man of methodical habits and precise mouth, and he never attended assemblies as a rule. He was carrying his brown leather case, and he looked, as he made his way through the room, like a man on his way to execute a specific professional function. He found Georgiana. He said, "Miss Hartwell, I received your note." He paused. "I also received a separate instruction this afternoon from His Grace, and I wonder if I might have a moment with you presently." She looked at him. She looked at the brown leather case. She said, "Yes." It was at this moment that the room's quality of attention shifted again, more sharply, because Edmund Ashcroft, Duke of Ashcroft, had entered through the Denborough House's principal door and was crossing the floor. He did not cross it toward Lady Vane. He did not cross it toward Miss Drummond. He crossed it toward the chair by the windows, where Georgiana sat in her gray dress with no fan and 16 pounds less than she had had the day before, and he crossed it in 3 strides that were deliberate and unhurried and completely visible to every person in the room, including Lady Vane, whose fan stopped moving. He stopped before her. The room was not precisely silent. The musicians in the gallery continued their phrase, but they continued it into a space that had changed its nature, a space that was now arranged, whether the musicians knew it or not, around the two people by the windows. He said, "You paid the Mabry debt from your own resources." She said, "It was £12. It was yours." His voice did not rise. It was still the surveyor's instrument. But there was something in it she had not previously heard, a bearing weight underneath the level surface, the kind of thing a foundation does. "Thomas found me this morning to tell me. He was very specific about the amount and about your face." She did not know how to answer that. "You wrote to Foss," he said. "You released the contract." "I am not a parcel," she said. "I told you that in January." He was quiet for a moment. Around them, the room waited with the particular breathlessness of a room that knows it is witnessing something procedurally important. "Miss Hartwell," he said, and then he stopped, and something in his face moved, the careful stonework of 4 years shifting along a fault line she had noticed in the room with the turned portrait. Georgiana. Her first name, precise and deliberate, landing in the room as an irrevocable reclassification. "I am asking you to remain. Not under the terms of any contract. Under none. I am asking because you sat with a child in a cold anteroom for 6 minutes so he could learn 3 notes of a tune. And because you saw a portrait's back and understood what it cost. I am asking because you told me you were not a parcel in the first 8 seconds of our acquaintance, and I have not been able to improve on that statement since." The room was very still now. Even the musicians had let their phrase conclude and not begun the next one. He extended his hand. "Mr." Foss cleared his throat from 3 feet away and opened his brown leather case and removed a single document, which he held in both hands with the professional calm of a man who has been asked to confirm a thing is true and is confirming it. "The contract arising from the Hartwell estate debt," he said, in a voice that carried to the nearest dozen guests, "is dissolved. The £4,000 debt is discharged in full as of this morning, separately addressed, no liability remaining. There is no legal instrument requiring Miss Hartwell's presence here." A brief, exact silence. "Which means," the Duke said, "that she is here because she chose to be." Georgiana looked at his extended hand. She looked at the room of 30-some people who had watched Lady Vane place her 12 seats away at a table and voice her narrow means in front of a dining room of 30 guests, and who were now arranged in a perfect attentive semicircle that included Lord Dunning's wife, the General, the young man from Nottinghamshire, and Thomas Mowbray's mother, Ellen, who had come in with the servant's entrance half an hour ago, and was standing at the edge of the crowd with her hands clasped and her face open in a way that no amount of proper assembly etiquette could close. She looked at Lady Vane. Lady Vane was very still, the fan at a precise 45 degrees, and in her face was something that was not humiliation, but was perhaps its quiet cousin, the recognition that the arrangement she had organized so carefully had not accounted for a woman who paid £12 out of her last 16 and then stood in a borrowed gray dress and told a duke she was not a parcel. She looked at Miss Drummond, who was young and had been told her entire life that she was the correct answer, and who was looking at Georgiana now with an expression that was not malice, but was the first genuine surprise of a woman whose certainties had finally met their specific limit. Georgiana looked at the Duke's hand. She thought of Thomas with 3 notes and a cold anteroom. She thought of the portrait turned to the wall. She thought of the lodge on a November morning, with the fire unlit and the door that had closed. She took his hand. The room exhaled. Lady Vane's fan resumed its careful motion. Miss Drummond looked away toward the refreshment table with the particular grace of a person who understands that a room has moved on and that continuing to face the same direction is no longer an available option. Mr. Foss closed his brown leather case with a soft and conclusive click, bowed to the Duke, bowed to Georgiana, and made his way toward the exit with the satisfied efficiency of a man who has executed a specific professional function and found it entirely in order. Ellen Mowbray pressed the back of her wrist to her mouth, once, and then composed herself. The musicians began the next phrase. Snow came to Ashcroft Hall in the first week of March, earlier than was expected, covering the kitchen garden and the north field path, and the stable yard where Thomas had tried to lift the hay bale, covering the gravel sweep and the stone face of the house, and the long sill of the library window where Georgiana sat that evening with a book open in her lap and the fire burning in the grate behind her. The library was the East Collection, which she had been using for 6 weeks now by means of a key the Duke had sent her in January, and it was a room she had made her own by increments. A shawl on the chair's arm, a small stack of volumes on the table to her left, a cup of tea Agnes sent up each evening without being asked, in the particular way Agnes had of demonstrating institutional sympathy through a cup of tea. Edmund was there. He was at the writing table on the far side of the room, working through correspondence with the specific concentration of a man who does not permit himself not to work, but who had positioned his chair so that it faced, at a slight angle, the window where she sat. She had noticed this. She had not mentioned it. They had been married by the village vicar on the 1st of March, a small ceremony attended by Mrs. Penn and Agnes and Thomas Mowbray, who had asked, with the directness of 9 years old, whether he was allowed to be there, and had been told by the Duke, in a voice several degrees warmer than his usual register, that his presence was specifically required. Lady Vane had attended. She had sat in the church pew in her jewelry and her good coat, and she had looked, for the first time in Georgiana's experience of her, like a woman who understood that the room had rearranged itself, and that she must rearrange herself accordingly. She had taken Georgiana's hand afterward outside the church door and said, "You are more than I accounted for, Miss Hartwell," and then corrected herself, "Your Grace." The title sat strangely, newly minted, not yet familiar in the mouth of either of them. Georgiana had said, "Thank you," and had meant it, because Lady Vane's recalibration was more honest than most people managed, and honesty was something she had always been willing to meet with grace. Outside the library window, the snow was still coming down, the sort of soft and steady snow that erases edges and makes the world legible in a different way, by what it covers and what it does not. The kitchen garden had disappeared. The north field path was gone. The stable yard was a clean, unbroken white, except for a single line of small footprints crossing it from the direction of the cottage, going toward the warm light of the kitchen. Thomas, taking the long way round, as he always did. She heard Edmund put down his pen. She heard the chair shift. He came to stand at the window beside her, looking out at the snow, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Because the snow was doing sufficient work, and they were both people who understood when sufficient work was being done. "I thought," she said, "when I came here in January, that this house would be the last constraint. And now?" She looked at the clean white of the kitchen garden, the warmth from the grate at her back, the single line of footprints crossing the yard. She thought of the east sitting room down the corridor, where, 2 mornings before, Edmund had carried the portrait down from the wall and set it, face forward, in the light near the window. Charlotte, dark-haired and clearly quick-tempered by the quality of her expression, looking out at a room she had once inhabited, looking out at the room Georgiana now inhabited with her. There was space, it turned out, for both of them. The house was large enough for grief, and for the particular new life that grew up alongside it, slowly and without fanfare, in the way of things that intend to last. "Now," Georgiana said, watching the snow, "it is the first room." The fire went on burning steadily behind them. The snow fell on. In the portrait across the room, Charlotte faced forward in the afternoon light, and Edmund's hand rested, warm and real and chosen, against Georgiana's own. If this story gave you anything worth carrying, leave a word in the comments. Stories like Georgiana's exist because people like you stay to the end of them.